Welcome to Restorers, a Water Street Mission podcast. Over these upcoming minutes, we'll be speaking with heroes in Lancaster County and beyond who are making a positive impact on men and women experiencing homelessness and poverty. Each episode, we'll speak with an expert from the community, as well as one of our own Water Street Mission staff members, to learn more about how each of them are working to make a difference locally. Without further ado, let's dive right in.
Welcome to episode 4 of the Restorers podcast. Today we're going to be talking about rethinking our emergency shelter model. And I'm really excited because we're going to be speaking with a friend of mine, Jim Reese, who is the president and CEO of Atlanta Rescue Mission. And Atlanta Rescue Mission and Water Street Mission have actually kind of gone through a very similar journey over the last several years of kind of looking at how we do emergency shelter through a completely different lens. And you'll hear from Jim about that, and then we'll get to talk later about some of the things we're doing here at Water Street. So in a moment, we're going to meet Jim Reese. He's going to be joining us through the magic of technology from Atlanta and joining in this conversation today as we talk about rethinking our homeless emergency shelter model. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today on our Restorers podcast. I always enjoy talking with you and hearing what's going on in Atlanta, and I'm especially excited to share you with our podcast audience that they can hear some of your insights and learnings down there in Atlanta and how that applies to ministries and people working with individuals in homelessness all around the country. So thanks for joining us.
Well, Jack, it's great to be with you, and same to you. It's always just a joy to be able to have time to talk about how do we better serve and just how we both through this journey of really God's given us ways to see it, different ways and unique ways to better serve those that come to our door each day.
Yeah. And our theme that we're going to be talking about today is this whole idea of rethinking the way we do emergency shelter. And I know several years ago now that you and I think we were at a CEO conference and we're chatting about kind of what we were doing in our programs. And we just saw so many similarities to our journey. I'd love to start with, could you share with me, Jim, how you and your team, like what was it that you saw in the way you were doing emergency shelter and maybe residential programming that you felt like, man, something's missing and we need to change? What was it? What was that moment for you?
Yeah, Jack, it was interesting because we had this large shelter with 300 men in particular, I'll say, and we had a women's shelter as well. And then we had a long-term residential recovery program. And each night when I was at our men's campus downtown, I'd watch 300 men walk in at 3, and at 7 o'clock in the morning, they'd all take off. And we would capture almost none of them, though 60 to 70% dealt with an alcohol and drug problem. And over here, I had this great drug and alcohol program, but it was nobody from our shelters were coming. And I just remember thinking, God has so much more for these men, especially as I got to know more of them. But I felt like if we keep doing what we're always doing, they're going to keep doing what they're always doing. And we're not really leveraging the talents even of the organization to begin to change the way the work was to better impact those men that were coming into our shelter. And that for us was a really huge learning, big change. I mean, it was scary, I think, for a lot because, they always ran so separately.
Yeah. Yeah. And that lack of capturing or that connection from those who were in the shelter coming over to residential, what were some of the barriers that you were able to unpack and see? Why was that happening? Why did they kind of stop where they were?
Well, it was very interesting because I think in a traditional recovery program, there was always this, you needed to hit bottom. And so as I would meet these men and they're, 16 years under a bridge, and I'm thinking, I don't know how much lower bottom is for them. And so that model of hitting bottom for someone who's below bottom doesn't work. And so for us, we began to see if we could begin to create a relationship, if we could begin to, we really came to the conclusion that the biggest issue they faced was relational poverty, not financial poverty, but everybody saw the financial issue. And so as we began building those relationships and they began to trust us, we began to see, we've got to do this differently than we have in the front. And it's not you come in at 3 and go out at 7. You got to do the whole thing differently.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great insight, and I love that emphasis on recognizing that poverty isn't just material poverty, but there's relational poverty is such a big part of that. And so even in that moment, the emphasis, it sounds like you did start intentionally getting engaged relationally with those guests as they came into shelter, but it had to go beyond that. It wasn't just, you could add relationship on the front end, be more intentional there, but that wouldn't necessarily guarantee that movement. Tell us a little bit, you guys reshaped your entire approach to not just shelter, but your long-term residential.
Yeah.
Um, Tell us about
So
it.
we took a really deep dive for 6 to 9 months, Jack. I had 3 board members and our team, and we looked at everything we did under a microscope. I didn't have confidence in what we were measuring. I just didn't have a lot of confidence in what we were doing, and we just peeled back, and nothing was sacred. And we interviewed clients, we interviewed staff, we interviewed the community, and then we looked kind of across the country based upon what we found. And we found we had a good recovery program and we had nobody out of our shelter. And we also realized in our shelter, it was much more just a place that we were giving someone a nice place to stay, but with little movement more than that. And it was still the best in Atlanta, but it wasn't what they had the potential. And so as we dug through that, it really became evident to us that we had to do something different. We realized that uh, we weren't connecting. And also, as we did those interviews, we began to quantify what the issues the men in the shelter had. And no wonder we weren't helping them, because we weren't addressing those, nor were we even giving them time. And, you come in each and every day and you go back out. Nobody was building relationships. No one was talking. We were just trying to manage a big number of people,
Yeah,
and it was a lot of people, right?
sure, sure. 300 people. It's all about shelter management and
Right.
safety and
And
everything.
all
It,
that,
it
right?
was going to take an investment of resources and time to develop the right kind of programs to be able to do that in that kind of environment. Our emergency shelter is 76 people. And
Right.
I know the challenge we have in building a relationship with that number, let alone 300.
And so for us, kind of when we did that, then Jack, as we looked across the country at different things, we looked at ministries, we looked across, we looked at cultures, we looked at faith-based and non-faith-based, we looked at employment, we looked at counseling, and from that, it was interesting because I felt God gave us kind of these 8 vision elements, and we knew nothing. To be honest, when I look back at it, but it was so clear because we felt those kind of became the guardrails of what was going to shape our overall change in our program.
Mhm.
And some of those was that we believed the most important thing was that they would come to know Christ, because that was really going to give them the hope.
Right.
We also felt like that the relationships were the most important mechanism to move people, though we hadn't done that. We didn't do that well in the shelter, but that was a key. We wanted to learn, and we didn't have to invent everything. We needed to partner well. We had to continuously improve, and we had to have a culture that really wrapped around all of that. And it's so interesting to look back, probably now almost 10 years since we did that, and see how God gave us clarity to what was really important. And, like one was there, we didn't have to invent everything. We could learn from others and use what they did. And, in our space that a lot of people, if it's not invented here, we're not going to use it. Right.
Right. Right.
And so it was very interesting to see.
Yeah. I kind of wish you had gone through your process like 3 years earlier, because then I could have met you on my first day
I know.
and learned everything you did. Our journey, and we've laughed about this before,
I know.
you identified an issue and a problem. You were able to invest time into research and learning from others, and actually just studying all about what you wanted to do, how you wanted to change it, before you implemented the change. Whereas when I came into my role, we had kind of dismantled a whole bunch of things first. And then I stepped into the role, and with Colleen, our VP of programs, we had to build the airplane while it was flying.
Right.
So we were replacing a wing and hoping we could stay in the air while we were putting a new one on. And but it's fascinating to me how God worked through both of those processes, and where we've landed today. There are so many similarities, but
Right.
what you're doing in Atlanta, what we're doing here in Lancaster. Um, just really briefly for our listeners' sake, could you give us a very quick overview of your Find Hope, Choose Help, and Make Progress model and what that means?
Yeah. Yeah, so for us, it became as we got into this, and we really felt that to get some, that one to get someone to come off of the street to take what we would call that first step of courageous faith, which even in a shelter to go to a program was going to be a big step, especially because of historically what we had done, that we needed to begin, that no one would make progress if they had no hope.
Mm,
So our whole thing of finding hope was, what did we do initially, building relationships, pouring into people to begin to breathe some confidence into them and encouragement into them that God had more for them,
yeah,
and we wanted to help them get more. And so they would come very hopeless, as you know, and our thing was, could we get you to a place of finding hope? Because you wouldn't make a step forward without hope.
right.
It just wouldn't happen, right? And so for us, that whole first thing was, we had ambassadors, which their primary job was to build relationships with them. We created day services that gave them experience to begin to see, I can sit in a classroom. And by the way, you know what? I'm not the only one that has this problem. And as you know, they tend to think they are the only one. And then they get in a room with 10 other people and all 10 have the problem. So as we built that out, we began seeing people building that relationship. And part of it was gaining confidence. And then they would move into our second phase, which was really around choosing help, which was for us, we would do a minimal assessment in Find Hope, but then go to a deeper assessment in Choose Help of what were the real specific needs, how deep was the trauma,
Mm,
were there alcohol and drug issues, what were the real issues,
yeah,
but continuing to build that relationship, but now in an environment that would be, you were part of classes, you were some of those things. And so Choose Help was kind of this interim step for us
yeah,
to give people a chance to stabilize some as well, even further. And then finally, we moved into really what I would call our real programmatic solutions, which kind of focused around drug recovery, trauma. We call it big T or little T trauma,
yeah,
depending on what they shape. We actually, vocational is a key component of that for us as well.
right.
And so we built wraparound teams with a social worker or client resource specialist, an advocate. So an ambassador in the Find Hope, Choose Help area became an advocate who
Mm,
really carried that relationship. And then we had a counselor and we had the vocational person. So one of the other things we learned in that was that as much as we might not believe it, individuals tie with individuals, and sometimes they connect and sometimes they don't. So
right.
many times the client might lose because they didn't connect like they should, or the staff didn't connect
Yeah,
with them. But in a team-based structure, you took that away
yeah.
because usually there'd be somebody on
There'll
the
be
team.
somebody. Yeah, if they only have one person working with them and they don't have a relational connection or yeah vibe there, like they can fail for all the wrong reasons. I love that with the team, and we talk about having three safe people
Right, right,
involved. And so at ours, it's we have a
right,
liaison, a case manager, and a life coach. Same concept. There's multiple
right.
touch points, people who are there to help you on your journey. And again, you one of them you may not really connect with, but if there's somebody you can trust and build trust and relationship with, it's so important.
No, I remember from our discussions, Jack, of kind of our make progress and what you guys were doing, that ideal of creating those relationships and having those teams. And for us, because our goal was to get them to three outcomes. We wanted them to begin to have community, which
Hmm.
ideally we wanted them to have a relationship with Christ and a relationship with others, because we learned through the data that we were shocked by how few had any relationships.
Right.
And so it's like so when they left us, if they didn't have any relationships, what were they going to do? And then the second part was, we wanted them to retain employment, not just get a job, because many had jobs and had
Yeah.
lost them. And then finally, that they would be able to both live and and have have responsible living with a place to stay. But we'd have to teach them sometimes, how do you live responsibly, because that was new for many of them. They
Right.
didn't understand that as those big three outcomes
Right.
that we would try and give them.
And on the journey to those outcomes, the things you have to process through with each individual are very different. And we've talked about that in some of our other
Yeah,
podcasts about how the things that lead to homelessness are as varied as the people who come through our door. And so that process, you can have the same outcomes desired, but the process and what you have to address along the way can be completely different. And to get there, it takes this trust building process. I love the
yeah,
model that you guys have, and even the language you've chosen in naming your program. Um, just that the finding hope, choosing help, making progress, and then as you help them as they move out,
right.
sustain and
Sustain
grow.
and grow. Right.
We've been talking
Exactly.
about sustaining restoration as our kind of
Right.
bridge phase out, helping people on that next part of their journey. But it speaks really to those different phases. And in an earlier podcast, we talked with Josiah Haken from City Relief up in New York City
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
that need to treat people with dignity, the importance of relationships, all those things. It's the full spectrum from the moment they come in the door through that transition where they choose help and are willing to stay longer and engage in more of a programmatic uh, environment with supports. One of the other things that we've talked about and we use a little bit in our programs through especially our case managers, but some of the model behind our program reflects what's known as motivational interviewing, which is a collaborative process where you're empowering the person to make decisions for themselves. How does that play in, especially maybe choose help and then heading to that the make progress phase for you guys? How does that idea of empowering the guests to identify for themselves what it is they want to work on?
Yeah, Jack, that is so I had a we had a one of our guys that was part of our design team, had his master's in counseling, went on to get his doctorate in counseling at Georgia State,
Mm,
and actually studied at our site the specific questions around choice.
yeah.
And one of the biggest learnings of all of that research was little choices are incredibly important for the population. So he quantified the importance of choices. So for us, it's become this anything we can do to allow you to begin to have some choices,
Mm,
like you said, choice of what, instead of us trying to pick what we think is most important for you first to go,
right.
which might be the most difficult for you. And it might be a big barrier,
Yeah.
but you're not ready to go attack it. In fact, many times it's why they would leave. Let's go work on what you said, what you want, which gets back to the choice. They feel when they look at their life, they have almost no choice
Mm,
in almost anything. And what Joshua learned through his research was that, choice made an incredible difference in outcomes.
mm,
I don't think, I'm not even sure you and I have ever talked about this, but this research was phenomenal on if we can find ways to give them little choices, even in their rooms. I mean, in all of those
yeah.
areas,
Wow.
they feel much more ownership to the process. And it's funny because there was a year on there, we do a Super Bowl party every year with our men, and one of the things that, and our donors were doing this, and one of the things the guys talked about the next day was they got to pick what they put on their hamburgers and how much they wanted, which was like, you're thinking, this is crazy. But one of the biggest thing was I got to decide how many pickles and all. And you don't realize when you're feeding the number of people we do, they don't feel they have any
Right.
choice, right?
Because we're looking
Well,
at efficiencies. Let's do the
right.
assembly line, get it out there. If they
How do
don't
you get
want
them?
that
How do
many
you feed
pickles,
them?
they can throw them out. But they got to make the
And
choice on the front end.
And it's like, you got to be kidding me that they, and it
Yeah.
went back to what Joshua's research said, give me a choice, give
Right.
me some choices. And so how do you find areas that give them choices?
Wow. Yeah. And that research backing that up is so powerful, but it should be, second nature to us to understand. We talk about dignity, right? And doesn't it express and communicate dignity to the individual to give them choice? Yet, so often in our world where we're providing services to people in need of help, um, we don't give choice. Like they have to make that really, really hard choice to say, I need help and I'm willing to come to you. And then immediately they enter an environment where all that choice is taken away. And it's, okay, you've come to me for help. Here's the kind of help. Here's what you need because you come through the door. I know what you need and we're going to provide it. And immediately it starts disempowering them again and putting them in an environment. So I love hearing how you guys have shifted your program in that way to give agency to your guests, to give that empowerment so they can own their journey. And I think that's one of the things we've learned from each other, and we continue to look at each other's models and the results we're seeing to refine. I also love the fact that you're constantly looking to improve what you're doing down there.
Well, same with you, Jack. Every time I talk to you, we're always trying to figure out what we can learn from each other. And I think, to your point, I think it's so easy to not look through their eyes of what they are facing and look through our eyes of what they're trying to get done. And which is the efficiencies, all the things you've talked about. And you've got to do that. I mean, you can't not do it.
Right.
But at the same time, that piece of really being able to be in their shoes and understand, because it's hard. It is very hard. And, I think it's at times I know for myself, you can forget that in the midst of it. And, we talk a lot about the most difficult decision for many of them is to come into the door the first time. Yeah. And so we've really tried to work more now on celebrating every step along the way, because two things happen. Our staff feel most encouraged by celebrating a client's success.
Right.
And we see clients who've been so under celebrated getting a chance to be celebrated, and that we'll look at the whole program and feel great about the end, when the honest truth is, and you've seen it, the biggest step anybody ever took was coming into the door.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like it to us from our eyes, that it seems like the most natural. And they go, that was the life-changing moment for them to make a decision to come in the door.
That is such a powerful insight, Jim. Yeah, I appreciate that. And that idea of celebrating those small wins, it empowers them to take the next step as well. Right. I have about 47 more questions for you, and I'm going to have to bring you back for another podcast and we can go deeper. But this has been a great conversation, Jim. Just love your heart and what you and your team are doing down in Atlanta. It's amazing. We learned so much from you, and I'm glad we have a chance to do that for each other. But thanks for joining us today. We're going to close this part of our podcast, and we'll be starting up again in a few minutes with our Assistant Vice President of Programs to talk a little bit about some of the changes we've made in our shelter to address exactly what Jim was talking about here. So thanks for joining us, Jim.
My pleasure. Love being with you. And just thanks for all you're doing and the lives that you guys are impacting.
I want to give a profound thanks to our Season 1 podcast sponsor, Rogers & Associates, who's helping us tremendously in this first year of the Restorers podcast. They're a wealth management firm that helps clients become financially independent for retirement. You can learn more about them online at rogers-associates.com or by calling 717-560-3800. That's Rogers, RODGERS-associates.com, or by calling 717-560-3800. Thank you so much, Rogers & Associates. Well, welcome back. This is the second part of our conversation here in episode 4, where we're talking about rethinking our emergency shelter model. And just had a great time talking with Jim Reese from Atlanta about some of the process they've gone through in rethinking their model. And we've done the same here at Water Street. We've been on a separate but similar journey, looking at our emergency shelter programming and our residential ministries, and how do we tie them together? How do we make it a more fluid journey between the two? So for the second part of our conversation, I'm really excited that Luis Rodriguez is with us. Luis is our Assistant Vice President of Programs here at Water Street. And Luis has been just a great part of our team here. So thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
All right. So as we think about this model, we were talking with Jim about how so often emergency shelter is just kind of it's its own world, and people come in and they cycle out and come in and cycle out. And both of our organizations were struck by, if we really want to help our friends who are experiencing homelessness on that journey forward in their life, how do we get them out of that cycle from shelter to embrace the idea of maybe there's more that I need? Could you speak a little bit to that, Lewis, as you've been working in our programs, overseeing shelter and residential ministries? What do you see as that key for helping people make that transition?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it starts with the individual. First, looking at every single guest created in the image of God. It starts there. It's an approach of love from the door. So when I think of like a guest first coming to campus and then getting the shelter, it's intentional about providing safe environment, safe and healing environment from the door. And our approach to that, knowing guests coming in are coming in with trauma, differing life experiences, and quite frankly, it can be a scary experience. And so watching them hit our door, meeting with a liaison, gathering information in the least intrusive way, from a trauma-informed approach, just enough that we need to screen them, to intake them, and then having that liaison walk them over to the shelter and hand them off to a life coach. And what I love about that is it brings out a piece of our model in the shelter of multiple encounters with 3 safe people. Yeah. And so in that approach, you see where they meet one staff member, which is liaison, handoff to a life coach in shelter. Right. And that starts the journey. And so it's this upfront approach of that journey of loving them well from the beginning.
Yeah. So it's the relational contact, it's love, it's building trust slowly over time. And the way we structure our emergency shelter is there's a window of time, that they're going to be with us, and we're gonna kind of slow walk in the beginning. But talk to me about, like, again, the mindset of an individual coming into shelter. Often it's like, man, I just need a place to sleep. This is what I'm dealing with. The presenting need is I've been crashing at a friend's house or sleeping somewhere that's not really safe or fit for humans, or I've been on the street, literally. Now, okay, I've had that need met. There's this relational dynamic, but what's the process to help somebody, like, say, maybe it's more than just a bed, maybe it's more than even just an apartment, maybe I need to work on some other stuff?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the relationship that are being built here at Water Street, those opportunities for conversations with those guests to understand where they're at, how they're viewing their situation in the moment, and also being intentional about slowly building that trust. And as you build that trust, it allows or segues, staff being able to resource our guests well. Yeah. And I think that relationship is a big component of it.
Are there touch points along the way where we can invite the guests to consider what their journey is going to be with us? Tell us about those touch points.
Yeah, so in shelter, right now, we're a 37 total stay shelter, but piloting also currently right now 67 day shelter. So right. During their guest stay in shelter, there's both formal and informal touch points, but the formal touch points happen about every 15 days. Okay. And the most important one being at day 21 of that journey, which we call an LC14, which is day 14, post their shelter contract. They have
stabilization for 7 days.
Yes.
And then they're kind of in the shelter.
Yes.
So what happens at that touch point?
Yeah, it's a check-in to see where the guest is at, to check in to see, how they want to continue their journey. Mm-hmm. From the door, case managers actually forecast shelter and residential to gauge even from the door where a guest might be at. but some guests might not know at that time. They may or may not. It may they may express interest in residential. They may not. That may change along the journey. But the LC-14 allows staff to gauge where the guest's at and check in with them. And sometimes a guest might indicate they just want to stay in shelter and finish out their 67 days, or they might at that point say, "Hey, during this journey here so far, I'm evaluating." My journey of cycling in and out of homelessness, or kind of where I'm at right now, and they self-identify needs that they got to go deeper in. And it's from that point of them making that awareness of change and expression of residential that kicks off that process for guests to experience that.
There's two things you touched on there that I think are really important. One is the concept of options for our guests are presented right from the beginning. So they know there's a couple paths they can choose from. Shelter, which is short term, and the resources, if they're in shelter, are going to be focused on how do we help you find a place to live.
Yes.
How do we help you maybe find employment? But the supports in that are really directed towards moving out and just finding your own place to live. Or the choice, and they're both presented from the beginning, of residential, which is, hey, you can stay longer and we'll develop an individualized plan that will help you address some of those issues that led to your homelessness, whether it's addictions, whether it's health issues, mental health issues. We'll walk with you on that journey to help address those things. So I think that's important, having both of those in front of our guests from the very beginning, but not forcing a decision. That we give them that time and space to build relationships, 7 days of stabilization, 14 days in shelter with these relationships, and then they talk about, okay, what journey are you looking for? And then you talked about self-determination. And how does that play a role? Like allowing the guests to really define, this is what I need to work on, as opposed to us saying, oh, you're here at Water Street, that means you need to work on X. We're allowing them to define. How do we do that? How do we invite them into that conversation? And how do you see that make a difference in whether people are willing to take the journey?
Yeah, I think it starts with just loving them where they're at. What I love about what you just dissected there is true, is that they have choice. And within choice is empowerment. A lot of times our guests lose that in their journey coming in, and they're at a low place, and they don't even realize that they still have choices. They still have power to make those choices. And I think doing that provides the level of dignity that they deserve that, along their journey gets lost. And so just by giving them choice and allowing them to choose their pathway forward, I think is a huge part of the trust journey, a huge part of the healing journey. And so by doing that, and regardless of what choice they make, they're going to be loved, they're going to be resourced well.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's the empowerment piece, and I think it allows them to have a stake in their journey, knowing that there'll be people that'll walk alongside them throughout that journey, whether it's finishing their 67 days in shelter, because case managers will be in there resourcing them, through housing, resourcing them, in various ways for that journey. And then if it's, hey, I want to continue this journey into residential, then it's, we move to intro to res, where they start to learn a little bit more about what that res experience is going to be like. And when you get to the point of like actually entering into res, and those action plans that you alluded to, the beauty about those is that they're not staff directed.
Right.
It's a collaborative approach where the guest is articulating, this is the track that I think, I need at this moment. And then, they choose, and with the help of case managers and staff along the way, it helps them, work through that process. But it's that collaboration approach that the guests are empowered to be a part of. I think that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, those two words, collaborative and empowerment, I think are so critical in how we've structured the programs. That kind of continuity from shelter into residential so that they can move forward and kind of help craft their own journey. And it reminds me of the concept and the approach in counseling of motivational interviewing, which, I wouldn't say that, we do use motivational interviewing. Some of our staff are trained in that and use it in their conversations, but it's also a concept that's been embedded across our programs. And to me, that's such a critical piece of it. And so motivational interviewing, the idea is it's not just a counselor only listening or a counselor giving advice. It's a collaborative approach that empowers the guest to identify for themselves and identify in this relationship, here's what I'm motivated to work on. Here's what I see as the biggest issue. Because it'd be very easy for us to do our assessments. We have a lot of assessment tools, right?
Yes.
And say, oh, here's the presenting issue. Here's the real root issue that they need to get to. What happens when a life coach or a case manager maybe expose some of where we've screwed up in the past? What happens when we tell a guest, this is your problem, and if you should consider staying with us so we can help you work on this problem?
I'm just going to be totally honest and transparent. It creates resistance.
Right.
Resistance to move forward, resistance to change. And and so giving and leaving that, the beauty about motivational interviewing is as it's developed through open-ended questions, the collaborative approach, but still allowing the guest to have the driver's seat, that's what it's about. And the beauty about knowing where they're at on stages of changes in terms of the motivation is what you want is small wins along the way.
Yeah.
Small wins along the way. And so when you identify what they're motivated to change and you start there and you support that, it doesn't mean you're always going to get big wins, right? It's not about the big wins. It's really about the small wins consistently over time that leads to moving along that continuum of stages of change. But that's the most important thing.
Yeah, and those small wins do two things, right? They build trust in the person who's walking with you because they've helped you achieve something and they celebrated with you that small win. And it builds confidence in the individual themselves that I am capable of change. I am able to overcome this. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I wonder if you could tell us, think about a story or a guest that you saw that kind of accumulation of small wins, whether it was during their time in shelter as they transitioned to residential or maybe when they first stepped into residential, those small wins bringing a new energy and life to them that led to big time change.
Yeah. Two guests come to mind, but I'll start first with a guest that I'll call Don, who had cycled in and out of Water Street through our shelter. And as we loved them every time they came back and worked with them and built relationship and built trust, what we find a lot is that it takes time for guests to get to the place where they're ready for that change or that deep dive for residential. But as we loved Don each time he came in, you saw that resistance to that level of change start to decrease because trust started to build. There was, the sense of empowerment. There was this safety built that created this I can do this in Don. And so watching him make that commitment to go deeper in life change and work on those things that were causing him to cycle in and out of homelessness, watching him get engaged in our residential program, go through our foundational classes, attend counseling, work with case managers and life coaches, you just slowly started to see him move along that pendulum of change, started to see the small wins. And the beauty about Don's story is that he went through our whole residential program, including transition. And while he was in transition, he was able to attend Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology, which was awesome to see because you saw him bloom, you saw him step into something that probably a few years back was never even on the radar, something that he probably would have thought he would never have been able to achieve. And by being able to be in a safe place, being loved, having people surround him, encourage him, walk with him through both the highs and lows. And that's what people have to understand. This journey for our guest is no different than our lives, the highs and lows, but having that support system really helped Don be able to not only heal and see his life through how Jesus sees him, right, which is a big component of that internal healing. Yeah. But to see him take that step of faith and be successful and graduate, and now is outside of Water Street and sustaining not only that life change, but that journey of employment. Yeah. And that to awesome. Me is an awesome story.
And the idea of going to Thaddeus wouldn't have even been on his radar screen if he hadn't not at all. Taken those small steps and small wins, even finishing a 6-week class here, and being faithful and making his appointments with his counselor and therapist like that. To do that and accomplish it and have that celebrated gave him the courage to take that next step and take on another challenge. I don't know if there's another guest that you could tell us a little bit about, and maybe even touch on what were some of those small wins along the way.
Yeah. I think about a guest named Greg, who had a similar early journey to Don, which was,
cycling in
and out. Yeah. And, he wore his shame. He wore his, the battered, life threw its best at him. And he wore that, and his addiction was getting the best of him. And what I love, and I can remember this because my journey here started as a overnight life coach. And so this story is going back now 5 years, but I remember just pulling him into the office and as well as other staff and just chatting with him and checking in, seeing how he's doing and forecasting like the opportunity for residential. Would you ever consider this? And many times he just wasn't there, which was okay. We loved him in the moment.
Still love him there. Yep.
Ministered to him in the moment. Reminded him of who he is, not only as a person, but as a child of God. Words create worlds. So I remember, looking at him in some of his deepest moments, and just telling him, "I'm proud of you for who you are and for where you are right now. I'm proud of you for sticking with it." And here's the thing. That was early on, and he would cycle in and out. And so those conversations would still be the same every time, and the encouragement and forecasting the opportunity of res. And one day, he accepted that opportunity. And that's where the real change started to happen. It was having those supports, having those resources, those small wins, the classes, completing the classes, building trust with staff, and knowing that one of the things with Greg that was in conversation with him early on that I think helped was because he was struggling in his addiction, he didn't realize that being out in the streets, he was being preyed upon by dealers. And he wasn't seeing his self-worth. And so part of it was, I remember having a conversation with him saying, "Hey, Greg, Res will also give you an opportunity to not have to be on the streets as often. It'll provide a safe place for you." Yeah. And it's like seeing him then get to a place where he stepped into that and seeing that transition, you saw life come back. Yeah. And that's the best. Yeah. Honestly, when I see him, it brings a smile to my face because I remember seeing the early stages of that res journey. Yeah. You started to see just the physical appearance of change on him. He started to look healthier. Life was infused in him. He started to see himself as God sees him, as a son, as a child of God, and that dignity was restored. Hope was restored. And and so for me, it was all of those things combined in that journey, but to see where he started and to where he is now is a true testament of that journey.
That's so cool to hear. And I think, again, those small wins can be, in our mind, so small, right? Like actually showing up night after night. Yeah. Making it one of the requirements in shelter when you sign your shelter contract. You got to be here every night, right? Yeah. And a small win is actually showing up every night. not bailing, not getting scared of the relationships that are starting to form and running away from that. A small win is just, hey, I was here 7 nights in a row. And for us to be able to celebrate that and empower them by showing they can do something and accomplish these small goals, and it opens the door to addressing bigger issues and setting bigger goals. And that's part of the journey that we're trying to create here at Water Street, this open door from shelter into res rather than 2 separate programs. We want our friends who are coming off the street from homelessness into our shelter to know that there's a pathway and a journey. And as we talked with Jim earlier, like when you hold them out as 2 separate things and you've got to choose residential from the gate, and there's all these guidelines you've got to jump into right from the beginning, it's a barrier. And it's an unnecessary barrier. So we've broken down those barriers and opened a pathway, and we see way more of our guests making that transition from shelter to residential, making that choice. And the journeys aren't always immediately successful, but the door's open, and we're seeing more of them step into that journey and going deeper.
Yeah, and it's scary. It's scary for them, and so helping them navigate that is so important. And one thing I love about our model into res, so similar to a guest starting shelter, having 7 days of stabilization, where it's like, come in, let us meet your basic needs, let us build a relationship. We just want you to come in and finally have a moment to breathe.
Right.
Similar to that 7-day stabilization, in entering res, there's what we noticed, and it wasn't always this way, but what we noticed is when guests transitioned, when they made that commitment, I want life change, I want to go deeper, I want res, and they started that journey. What we realized, because it wasn't always this way, but what we realized is that transition was huge for them. Mm-hmm. It was going from low accountability, and what I mean by that, it just wasn't we don't set up our shelter with a bunch of things for our guests to do, because we want them honestly to be loved, to have that pause, to work through some of these things, to build a relationship. And that doesn't change in res. That just continues. That's what I love about the streamlined approach from shelter to res. The relationship doesn't end. But then there was a transition where from that to res at one point was jumping right into a full action plan. Even though the guests were a part of that, it was self-directed, and then we just supported that. It was a lot for them. And so what we created was the first 30 days of res, they have an orientation action plan, which is 30 days to just solely orient them and bridge that transition, because we want them to be successful.
So you're not getting hit when you come in the door with, boom, here's all your requirements. Here's a high level of accountability for all of these aspects of it. During orientation, it's kind of like gradually introducing. Here are new aspects of it, so they can build up kind of their own resiliency in it and strength for the journey. I love that, and I think that's such a critical piece. I'm glad you brought that out, Lewis, because I think that's such a key piece to that, because it can be scary going from that lower accountability shelter to suddenly, okay, now I'm on this long-term journey, and wait a second, this is overwhelming to me. So that idea that you and the team have put together, that orientation phase where we can gradually ramp up accountability for them on the journey, is so good. We're going to go in more detail on our next podcast about our residential ministry. We got to talk a little bit with Jim about their model at Atlanta and how they do that. We just touched on a little bit today what we do here at Water Street. Next podcast, we'll go in depth about the whole person approach and some of the things that we really dig into. But I appreciate you being here, Lewis, for sharing some of your insights into how we help our guests kind of make that journey from shelter into residential, the importance of relationships and empowering them, that whole motivational interviewing concept that's embedded. You brought that to life. So appreciate you sharing, Lewis, and joining us today. I hope this was an interesting journey for you as well as you listen to our podcast today. Thanks for joining us.